You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can find out over there all the places where this show broadcasts, as well as all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. Look at their entire schedule and map out your day. And for listening anyway. And you can also, if you're just listening to this show, you can come on over and watch it in video over on my YouTube channel. And that is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the chat room and the other Intrepids that are already there chatting. And join in on the conversation. Add your 2 cents worth to the program. Criticize, speculate, opine, skepticize, whatever you want to do. You're welcome to do that over there, and you can talk with all the other folks that are joining in. And so welcome to the show tonight. I got to tell you, today, I don't know if it's being sequestered, quarantined, or what it is. You would think that, that would be an easy thing to do, but as every day goes by, I seem to get stiffer and stiffer. And a little more sore, a little more, I don't know what it is, because, frankly, I don't go out all that much anyway. I'm here all the time. You can measure how active your life is by the places you go and the things you do. And my lifestyle really hasn't changed a lot. Maybe that's a little frightening when you think about it. But, I would get out. I would go do things. I would go to the store. I went to a couple of parties. I went to a couple of meeting friends for drinks and coffee and things like that. I haven't traveled in a long time. It's been about a year. Well, no, I take that back. I traveled down to Key West for filming on that Bermuda Triangle show back a few months ago. But, I don't get out that much anymore, it seems. It's like I'm always in because we're always home. I'm always working. My studio is here. And the family is here, but now that we're sequestered, you realize how much you don't get out, or how much you did get out before this. So I'm hoping this all ends pretty soon. I need to get out. I need to stretch. I can stretch at home. I can take a couple of towels, wrap it around my foot and stretch and pull and do things and whatever. I don't have any workout equipment at home. I do have a stationary bike. I should probably break that back out. But all I'm saying is little stiff and sore today. I got to loosen up. I got to do some yoga or something. If anybody does yoga, let me know all about yoga. And I'm only thinking of that from, not because I want to wear Lycra tights or anything like that, but because I need to limber up. I'm getting pretty stiff and sore. So there you go. At least talking on the radio doesn't involve a lot of reaching and stretching. So I'm okay that way. Today, I want to pick up on all the stuff we've been talking about this week, but I want to go to a little different place. And maybe by the title of tonight's show, if you saw that upcoming before you listened or watched, you know that I'm going to be hitting some things that can cause a little mystery, a little skepticism in some people. I'm going to talk about the Druids a little bit because we mentioned them a couple of times over the last couple of days and looking at the mystery language. But I want to look at the Druids a bit, and that's going to very quickly kind of pinwheel off into talking about something that either immediately brings, what's the word I want to look for? Skepticism, rolling of eyes, or people who are very interested in the topic on the converse side. And that's the topic of Atlantis. Now, we may spend more than one day talking about Atlantis, but we're going to spin off into that as we start talking about the Druids, and you'll see where we're going to take it. And the reason I bring up Atlantis is when we were talking about the mystery language, I was looking into a lot of Blavatsky's work. And Blavatsky was a big believer that Atlantis was a real place. Now, I think there's a lot of people out there, even scientists, that say, it's very possible. There's a lot of speculation. We're going to dig into some of that. We'll take a look at that. So you could be very fascinated by the topic. You could be very put off by the topic as being one of those that is kind of, rather stupid. But there is some evidence out there, and there's a whole lot of, I use the quotation marks in the air, evidence in the more mystical realms of things. And we'll get into that and why I say it that way and why I use that. But to start off, I want to get into talking about the Druids. And these two topics are not really two topics that should be presented in one episode of this show. So like everything else I do around here, we're going to do probably more than one day on these things. But I wanted to start off with the Druids and kick off into the whole Atlantean thing. And in the Druids, there's a bit of a mystery behind the Druids. And that is that we don't really know much about them. We have some idea, but we're going to look at the origins, the beliefs, the teachings of the Druids, and frankly, about which so much nonsense has been written in books and on the internet. It's ridiculous. It makes your head spin. And so it's popularly thought that the Druids were Celts, the Celtic religious caste. And others have speculated that they were a caste of priests who migrated to Britain from India or Chaldea. In order to discover the truth of the matter, we have to go back to a very long way indeed to find out where these guys came from. Even modern scholars, such as Barry Cunliffe in his book Druids, a very short introduction, that was published by University Press about 10 years ago, he admits that although the earliest written references we have go back some 2,400 years, the origin of these ancient philosophers and teachers remains fairly enigmatic. It's still a mystery, in other words. And not that we recommend the book. I'm not saying go out and pick up his book, which are just over 150 pages. Really tells you nothing worthwhile about the Druids. However, you have to agree that with the eminent professor of archaeology that the so-called Celtic languages originated on the Atlantic coasts of Europe and spread eastward, a view that's not shared by the majority of the good professor's colleagues. Nonetheless, his theory is correct, as we'll see later. We'll dig into this a little bit. And so another widely held belief is that Druids performed human sacrifice. Now, indeed, the esteemed Wikipedia, that fountainhead of unbiased and accurate facts, tells us that this, in no uncertain terms, that the Greek and Roman writers frequently made reference to the Druids as practitioners of human sacrifice. And there was even a National Geographic documentary that was broadcast on TV back in 2009, so again about 11 years ago, that affirmed this popular notion, and it drew on considerable historical and archaeological evidence to support it. And we're going to take a look at that point, too. May or may not hit that point tonight, but we're digging in. I got a ton of material up in front of me. And so let's start with the origins of the Druids. Now, although there were Druids that were amongst the Celtic tribes, this doesn't prove that all Celts were Druids. And this is a trap into which a lot of writers have fallen. The ancient authors were... It's like saying because we have Catholic cathedrals all over the United States that all citizens of the United States are Catholic. It just doesn't work that way. And so, as we all know so well. So, the ancient authors were unanimous in saying that the Celts came from the east. And it might be that they were right, but on the other hand, it may be that those Celts were fugitives from Here it comes. Dun da da da. Drum roll, please. Atlantis. And they spread all over the then known world. And let's see what those old writers say about the Celts. They at least were nearer to the times that these people lived, and so you'd think that they might know a little bit more about them than modern experts who cling to the beliefs that civilization began with the Greeks and that there was nothing the ancients knew that they did not know better. Caesar tells us that the Gauls were always called the Celtae by the Romans, and the Greeks Celtae or Celt. And whenever the first century, and by the way, the basketball team, the Celtics, I don't know why they use the name Celtic and pronounce it with an S sound. That's just a pet peeve of mine. Every time I saw that while I was in school and I hear the Celtics, Larry Bird, that's my era. And I'd say it's not Celtics, it's Celtic. But anyway, there you go. It's like calling, the Atlanta Braves the Braves. I don't know. That's dumb. Let's move on. Whenever the first century Greek poet Parthenius speaks of the Gauls in the story of Hercules and Celtina, he makes use of the term Celtina or Celtum. And in the same story, Diodorus, Sicily, for Pete's sake, I'm stumbling over my sisses and kitses and didzids. So Diodorus Siculus calls the Gauls Celts or Celtae, of Parthenius Galtaeus, and the people of the Galatians. So you might be the most familiar with the word Galatians if you know your New Testament, the book of Galatians that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Galatians. And the 2nd century Greek scholar and poet Callimachus, in his Hymn to Delos, which was the birthplace of the god Apollo, indiscriminately uses the words Galates or Galatia and Celtae for one another. He interchanges them. Virgil calls the inhabitants of Cisalpine Gaul or Galtae, and this was the northern parts of Italy, inhabited by Celts during the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, and later conquered by the Romans in the 2nd century BC. And still it was merged into the Roman Republic. The Abbé Paul Pezron, who lived in the 1600s to the early 1700s, he wrote about the Celts, and he said this: at least a part of them were called Cibrians and Cimmerians, and that's with a C, Cimmerians, before they bore the names of Galatae and Gauls. And Herodotus, that 3rd century BCE historian that I love so well, tells us that the Celtae are the most remote inhabitants to the west of Europe. In other words, closer to ancient Atlantis. And there's that word that comes up again, that name that comes up. And at the mouth of the river Elbe, on Herodotus' map, is called Amber or Umber, now Hamburg. And this nearly opposite to the northeastern shore of England, where we find the river Umber or Northumberland and Cumberland, showing once again the close links between these various descendants of Atlantean immigrants, it is proposed. And so the Celts have been traced back by some imaginative historians to Gomer, the eldest son of Japheth, one of the 3 sons of Noah, whose name was perpetuated in the Gomerians and afterward called in the west of Europe the Cimbri and the Cimmerians. And it's said that these people, by abbreviation called the Cimbri or Cimbri, were the same race as the tribe called the Senones, who under their leader Brennus pillaged Delphi in Greece during the 4th century BCE, and they're unanimously called Gauls. And the 1st century BCE philosopher Poseidonus states definitely that the Greeks gave the Cimbrians the name of Cimbri or Cimbrians, however you want to pronounce. There's that Celtic thing. The Cimbrians gave the name of Cimbri. And so the ancient Britons, too, were called Cumeri and Cimbri. And we've not given you all these different theories simply to pad out the time here and to try to give you there's something to that. I don't want to waste your time with this, but it kind of sets a proven track that there's been a lot of guesswork on the part of all these ancient writers who couldn't account for the mysterious Kimri at all, but sought in vain to discover their origin in Europe and Asia. And this was and remains kind of a hopeless quest, because it looks more and more like, now here's where we get speculative, but there is evidence for this, like the Druids originated in Atlantis, or a place called Atlantis, or referring to an Atlantean culture. Now you got to get the storybook and the fairy tale out of your mind, the fantasy, and say, is there any basis for this? So, just as the Druids did, they all came from this Atlantean culture. Now, Caesar tells us in his commentaries on the Gallic War that Druidism originated in Britain, and that was its great stronghold. I've got this little book, and I love this. I love hardback books. This particular little book I picked up for a dime at the local thrift barn that we have. There's just a big barn here locally in small town Wisconsin. And they have, shelves and shelves of books and libraries that have been donated. And this was a book that I found on their shelves, and I got it for a dime. It's called Caesar's Gallic War. And it's the first 8 books of Caesar's Gallic Wars. And so I wanted to look this up. And I actually found it here in Caesar's Gallic War, and it's book 6 of the 8 that are contained in this book, and it's the 13th chapter. Caesar says this, Julius Caesar wrote this. He says, throughout all Gaul, there are 2 orders of those men who are of any rank and dignity, for the commonalty is held almost in the condition of slaves, and dares to undertake nothing of itself, and is admitted to no deliberation. Now, he didn't think highly of the Celts, but he spoke highly of their ruling class, their religious class. They had rank and dignity, and the greatest part, when they are pressed either by debt or the largest amount of their tributes, or the oppression of the more powerful, give themselves up in vassalage to the nobles, who possess over them the same rights, without exception, as... hold on, the type is so small on this, forgive me for this. As masters over their slaves. But of those 2 orders, one is that of the Druids, the other that of the Knights. The former are engaged in things sacred. They conduct the public and the private sacrifices and interpret all the matters of religion. To these a large number of the young men resort for the purpose of instruction, and they, the Druids, are in great honor among them, for they determine respecting almost all controversies, public and private, and if any crime has been perpetuated, they murder as has been committed, or if murder has been committed. If there be any dispute about an inheritance, if any about boundaries, these same persons decide it, and they decree rewards and punishments, and this goes on and on. And he says the Druids do not go to war, nor pay tribute together with the rest. They have an exemption from the military service and a dispensation in all matters. I think, first of all, I think it's fascinating to be reading the actual words that were written by Julius Caesar, and I thought it was interesting. Now, he goes on here, and this is all very small chapters that these are, but in chapter 16, he said, the nation of all the Gauls is extremely devoted to any superstitious rites. And I'm looking for the exact place where it says, where he says they... now, this is the worship. I've got something written here in my notes of what chapter to find this in. It's chapter 18. So I'll move on here. This is chapter 16, 17, It's in Roman numerals, and it's not divided. You can see it's not really paragraph divided with extreme amount of white space. So it's got the chapter listing at the beginning of the paragraph. So you got to scour this. And by the way, this little book that I got for a dime, this was published in 1895 by the Penn Publishing Company, and in 1890, that's so small, in 1896. So I've got the 1896 edition here. So this book is 104, more than that, 100, you do the math, 110 years old or something. So it's very interesting to have this in my hands. But he says in chapter 16 or 18, all the Gauls assert that the Druids are descended from the god Dis, D-I-S, and say that this tradition has been handed down. It's all the Gauls assert that they, the Gauls, are descended from the god Dis, D-I-S, and say that this tradition has been handed down by the Druids. And for that very reason, they compute the divisions of every season, not by the number of days, but of nights, and they keep birthdays and the beginnings of months and years in such an order that the days follow the night. And among other usages of their life, they differ in this life from almost all other nations, that they do not permit their children to approach them openly until they're grown up, so as not to be able to bear the service of war, and so on, and he goes on and on and on. Now, I don't see here exactly and precisely where it says that he believed that the origins of the Druids had anything to do with coming from Atlantis, but he does say that they come from Britain, and that Druidism originated in Britain, which was its strongest, greatest stronghold. And he says they know much about the stars and the celestial motions, and about the size of the earth and the universe, and about the essential nature of things, and about the powers and authority of the immortal gods. And these things they teach to their pupils. And all this is true, but as we're going to see here, Druidism didn't originate in Britain, but in what is claimed to be Atlantis. And we're going to dig into that a bit. And the great similarity that exists between all the alphabets of the various nations shows a definitive link. And if we compare, for instance, the letters of the Samaritan, the Hebrew, the Chaldean, the Greek alphabets, placed in their true ancient positions, and then compare these with, for instance, the Irish Boboleth alphabet and the ancient Etruscan alphabets, and so gradually approach the English letters we have today via all these other systems, the link appears very clearly, and it points to one common source: Atlantis. And you might study this on your own. There's a ton of information out there, but I want to dig into it a little bit now in the second segment, because we're just about closing off the first segment. But according to Julius Caesar, the Gauls used to go to Britain to improve themselves in the discipline of the Druids. And this may mean that France and Britain used the same language in those distant times. And the oldest inhabitants of Spain, the Turdante, were Celts like the Druids in England. And the first century Greek historian Strabo says that they possessed laws written in verse 1,000 years before Strabo's time. And this information is there. It's there to be looked at. But I want to go out to break right now, and I want to come back, and I want to talk about this Atlantean connection that's being made. The facts, perhaps, and the fallacies, and the fantasies, and the fancies about Atlantis. So sit tight. We'll be right back in a couple of minutes. All right, gang, thanks for hanging on there during the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're back with the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And by the way, if you hear my phone beeping and digging, it's plugged in here, and it's a brand new phone as of yesterday, and I can't seem to find a way to turn off certain signals yet that it gives me, so I still got to dig in. Hopefully I'll have that remedy today, and by tomorrow's show, we won't have that interruption anymore, or I'll have to leave it out there. So, by the way, Odyssey Radio is at ODYSY1.com. You can find out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio, and you can come over too and see this broadcast in its video form, simulcast during this live show, and that's over on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the very frenetic, eclectic, electric chat room that is populated by all the Intrepheads during this show. Add your 2 cents worth, join in the conversation. So welcome, either way. If you're just joining us in the second half, we were talking about some of the origins of the Druids, and there's a whole lot more I want to cover about the Druids and Druidism. But before I do, because Atlantis keeps getting brought up, I want to address the topic of Atlantis. And even this might take us more than just the 23 minutes we have left of this program. And so, now, put on your thinking caps, wear your steel panties or your steel briefs, and sit back and, well, you can join in the conversation in the chat room. But let's talk about this topic of Atlantis. Some of these occult writers that I reference and whose works I use as the basis for some of my research, I like a lot of the things they have to say on a spiritual realm, but sometimes you've got to delve into what I would consider to be the fancy of that. And so Atlantis is one of those things, because while there's a lot of speculation and a hell of a lot of research that's been dumped into the search for Atlantis, it's trying to decipher what Atlantis really is. Plato mentions Atlantis and the destruction of Atlantis. Was he speaking in allegory? Was this just a story he was telling? There is countless numbers of books, television shows, documentaries made on the search for Atlantis, but nobody has yet been able to take a flag and stick it into anything either above water or below water that indicates that Atlantis was here. This is the definitive spot for Atlantis. And so there's a lot of facts and fancies and fallacies about Atlantis, and I thought this might be a good time to segue over into talking about this mysterious place. Is it as mysterious as we've been led to believe, or was it just a landmass? We know for a fact that there was tectonic plates and that there was movement. We know, off the coast of southeast England, Britain, that was all, what they call that, Doggerland, that connected to France, that was a vast open area. They're finding artifacts of villages and remnants of villages and things like that down in that area. It was all lowland, and now that's all covered by ocean. Is this what Atlantis was, this type of place? So let's look at trying to separate some of the facts from fiction and dispel some of the fancies that surround the subject of Atlantis. And now, it's not my intention to so focus on Atlantis that we're doing a huge treatise on it. I don't wish to add to all the speculations about its supposed location. I don't want to feed the appetite of people who like to be thrilled by the weird and wonderful fantasies that are derived from all different kinds of things, including channeled sources. You know, the channeled so-and-so came to me in my dreams, and I'm speaking and I'm writing it down. You know, I don't know that I trust all that stuff. But least of all am I interested in proving the existence of Atlantis to the satisfaction of skeptics and those who think it's a bunch of hooey. My aim is to give you some of the facts that exist, not the fancies, and you can verify all these things for yourself. So, if you're interested in Atlantology, as the scientific study of Atlantis is termed, there's all kinds of books I can refer you to, all kinds of shows I can show you, and maybe I'll list a few of those at the end of this segment. But all these sources treat the subject in a thoroughly scientific and factual manner, and make no comment on the very many books, both past and present, which treat the subject in unscientific manner, because there's a plethora of those as well. Other than to say that having read the very best books by some of these visionaries, or at least skimmed some of them, I remain profoundly skeptical about the majority of the claims about Atlantis, and with very few exceptions. And the information imparted by all these different sources is so trivial and ordinary that it really tells us nothing worthwhile about Atlantis. So, Colonel Brahim, in his introduction to The Shadow of Atlantis, his book, says, "It's to be regretted that the various visionaries and novelists have exploited the subject of Atlantis, and their activity has alienated it from the attention of many serious truth seekers, and created around it an atmosphere of fancy and fiction." Now, this is probably the idea where your science fiction Atlantis comes in. An advanced civilization with advanced technology, like the animated Search for Atlantis, was it called? Fun movie for kids. And they're making that into a live action, Disney is, so I've read. But it's all the flying cars and stuff like that, and it's interesting. But that's all the stuff of fiction. And it's ever truer today when Brahim wrote these words in 1938, is when he said that. And we know where we are with a novel. And we don't expect to do it anything more with a novel than to entertain us for an idle several hours or so it takes to read it. Fancy masquerading as fact, however, is a totally other matter. You pick up a novel and read this stuff and spend time reading it, you expect novelty. You expect fiction. You expect fancy and a sci-fi. But when you have it masquerading as fact in so-called non-fictional books, it becomes misleading and dangerous for the greater, genuine seeking of truth about the matter. So, and you get that in a lot of things. I look at a show like Ancient Aliens. I appeared on Ancient Aliens in several episodes. But much of what they do is they extrapolate fiction and fancy and try to make it into fact about, and that's all I'm really going to say about that. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, that's not to say that a trained clairvoyant can't discover accurate information about the distant past. And many have. I know people who have done this. I don't doubt clairvoyancy. I doubt many practitioners of clairvoyancy as to whether or not they're true or real or not. But the problem is that so many psychics, mediumistic persons will embroider what they've seen or heard or experienced clairvoyantly with the fanciful speculations of their own. The untrained minds, the completely obscuring and distorting any useful information that may be discovered through their visions. Think of remote viewers. When they're just delivering, they're spilling out fact as they see it, you start embellishing or embroidering those facts with what you think you know that you've gleaned from science fiction. You start getting a very distorted picture. You can sift through the gold from the dross in some of the visions that some of these people have had. The average reader might miss that. And they're not even looking for it. It's just what exists in most cases. And so I hope you're listening to this and you are somebody who prefers to have facts before you, not the fantasies that are founded upon evidence anyone can verify for themselves. And this is the aim of this little presentation. It's to review the facts about Atlantis as recorded by such great minds as Plato, Solon, Herodotus, and others, and together with the scientific researchers of the more modern times by open-minded investigators, Donnelly, Breheen, Wishaw, N.F. Zirov. At the same time, I hope to dispel some of the fancies which cling to the subject in the minds of many mystics and occultists, and the way they present the thing. So, Atlantis, is it a myth or a reality? Now, I have no doubt that there was something called Atlantis, or that we have dubbed Atlantis, that once existed. It had a location. After a lifetime spent investigating the subject in a thoroughly scientific manner from every conceivable angle, geographically, ethnographically, linguistically, astronomically, anthropologically, to name but a few of the different science tools that are needed if we wish to arrive at the truth and not fantasy. We've seen this all through my lifetime, from my youngest viewing of things like In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy, my first exposure to some of the weird mysteries of things out there. We've seen all of this stuff presented. But can you arrive at the truth and discard what is the fantasy? And I have to add that anyone who doesn't take the time and trouble to do this, to separate things out, and I expect the same thing, even if you read some of my stuff on the Nephilim, the reptilians, you've got to be able to separate truth from fantasy, fact from fantasy. And they're the type of dogmatic skeptics that come forward. We see them on television, we read about them in articles, and they smugly assert that there was no point in investigating the subject of Atlantis at all from the get-go, as land does not rise or sink overnight. And this despite the evidence of the eruption of new islands in the modern times, such as Surtsey, which appeared off the coast of Iceland in 1963, and by 2008, 69 species of plants had been found on this island. And so when we have the sinking of the island of Thera, which is modern Santorini, which a lot of people have focused on as being a site for Atlantis. It sank into the Aegean Sea about 1500 BCE. And if small islands can rise and sink, why shouldn't very much larger ones, continents, do so? Could this be in continental shift that we have seen some of this? That's my own speculation added onto the topic. So it's only a matter of scale, not of principle. Was Atlantis big? Was it small? Was it a continent? Was it a huge island? So quite why dogmatic science refuses to accept this simple fact in the face of such clear evidence is a question that I got to leave for you to ponder. Why do we know of sunken lands, rising islands, things like that? Why do we know of these things, yet some scientists say it doesn't exist, that Atlantis couldn't have happened this way? And so these are entrenched attitudes, and they're sadly all too common among scientists, who remind us of the verse from the book of Matthew, in which the apostle berates the blind guides. He said, "We strain at a gnat and swallow a camel." And so material science swallows a hell of a lot of camels, such as electricity, which, despite the uses to which the effects of this force have been put, remains a mysterious, incomprehensible entity whose origin can't be explained, any more than magnetism or gravity. Yet science continues to strain at the gnat of Atlantis. So pseudo-historian, pseudo-archaeologist, pseudo-ethnographer, pseudo-anthropologist, they're all just a few of the epithets hurled like thunderbolts of Zeus, who existed, by the way, from the eminence of established scientific orthodoxy at any soul that's brave or foolish enough to challenge the accepted dogma. And this could be across the board, folks. I'm applying this to Atlantis here right now, but it's across the board. They say that Atlantis is a myth invented by Plato, and we're tempted to retaliate by calling those pious priests of historical correctness pseudo-sapiens, because they appear to have no ability to think for and by themselves. And perhaps this is a little unkind, to put it that way. And as you listen to this, we have nothing to lose by speaking our mind on these things, or stating a proposal, or offering up a hypothesis. And the professional historian or archaeologist who dares to challenge the accepted dogma about Atlantis isn't so fortunate. At best, he or she will be ignored, marginalized, derided. At worst, they may face professional ruin, loss of income, health, and all this entails. And need we wonder that the wiser dissenters from the prevailing orthodoxy keep their heads down? Now, I know a lot of people. I was listening to Dr. Robert Schoch, who we had at the Paradigm Symposium, and who I was listening to on Joe Rogan's show, was talking about certain theories that he puts forward that others won't. They come to him because they don't want to lose their tenure, or they don't want to be considered idiots. And so he presents some of this information. Even himself steps out on a limb to present some of his research on the Sphinx and the water damage on the Sphinx and so on. He was along with John Anthony West, if you can place those names. So here are some of the ancient accounts of Atlantis. We've got about 9 minutes left of this show, so let's hit some of this. The earliest known specific accounts of Atlantis are the narratives that are given by Plato, great philosopher, in his Timaeus and Critias. And it was written in 360 BCE. And Plato said he obtained his information from the writings of Solon, who was in around 600 BCE, who in his turn obtained his knowledge from the Egyptian priests who presided over the last mystery schools in the temple of the goddess Net, or Neith, if you want to say it that way, at Sais in Egypt. And this is significant, for as Plato has also been initiated into the mysteries, and he wasn't permitted to divulge and declare all that he knew. He could merely hint at certain things, because these were the esoteric, the inner mysteries of the greater mysteries. And so he was an initiate. And now I have to suggest that he carefully merged and mixed up the history of Atlantis, which covered several millions of years, into one event, which he located on one comparatively small island of Poseidonus, whereas the Egyptian priests spoke of Atlantis as a continent as large as all Asia and Libya combined. But however altered in its general aspect, Plato's narrative bears the stamp of truth. Nor did he invent it, as many modern authorities assert, since Homer, who preceded him by many centuries, also speaks of the Atlantis, who are the Atlanteans, the Atlantes, and of their island in his Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey. And so in Plato's Timaeus, you might read this: "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are all children, and there is no such thing as an old man among you. You are all young in mind. You have no belief rooted in old tradition, and no knowledge hoary with age. In our temples we've preserved from the earliest times a written record of any great or splendid achievement or notable event which has come to our ears, whether it occurred in your part of the world or here in Egypt or anywhere else. Whereas with you and others, writing and the other necessities of civilization have only just been developed when the periodic scourge of the deluge descends, the flood, and spares none but the unlettered and uncultured, so that you have to begin again like children, in complete ignorance of what happened in our part of the world or in yours in early times." That was written by Plato. And we have no reason to dispute this account, especially as it agrees with the histories that were preserved by many other nations, such as the Chaldees and the Jews, or the Hebrews, the Israelites, and regarding the various floods that have inundated the earth at different times. Remember when I talked about the Great Flood, when I was talking about in my book on the Nephilim, and I talked about the flood, and it said there are over 600 different ancient cultural and tribal accounts of a great flood, stretching from a localized flood, the regional flood, to a universal flood. And so this exists, and these things are written about in all these different cultures. It also partially explains why there's no complete records of the history of Atlantis to be found in any book. Imagine if a similar disaster befell our Western civilization. We're getting a glimmering of that now. We think of, what if this coronavirus thing, what if this wipes out mankind? What if it does? What if we lose the grid? What if everything falls and civilization decays? Who's going to know about us? That's the idea. And so there are no complete records that exist. But imagine if a disaster like that fell us, the one like we know of in Atlantis, or at least that is recorded about Atlantis, that the whole continent disappears in an afternoon. What would remain of our boasted arts and our sciences, our great engineering works, our technology? And even 1,000 years after such a catastrophe, would we have to begin again at the beginning, just as the survivors from the drowned Atlantis had to do? Plumbers and builders, not to mention carpenters and farmers, would be hailed as the greatest of men, if not regarded as veritable gods by the rest of society. Well, society, humanity. Whilst historians and poets and writers would be well drawn way down the pecking order of social utility. So when you talk about right now, they're talking about essential workers can go to work. How many historians are there? How many philosophers are amongst those? It's usually the people that keep society afloat, no pun intended. And so there's other reasons for the paucity of ancient accounts of Atlantis, not least the wholesale destruction of so many books and manuscripts by the various invaders of Egypt over many millennia. Had Diocletian not burned the esoteric works of the Egyptian temples in 296 AD, Caesar incinerated 700,000 rolls at Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria, and the Muslims put to the torch all the ancient books they could lay their sacrilegious hands on, the modern world might know a whole lot more about Atlantis than it does now. Think about it in those terms. As it is, Plato's account is the best we have. Those of you who are not familiar with his narratives can find them easily online. Just look up Plato's account of Atlantis and read it. They're well worth reading in their entirety. And unless you want to completely dismiss the story of Atlantis as a political allegory intended to promote his views on morality and statehood, as most modern scholars do with his work, we're compelled to accept his testimony for what it is, as with most of the rest of his works on the histories, and that is they're a history of real events. And when we also consider these stories corroborated by earlier writers such as Herodotus and Homer, it's hard to believe that the Athenian sage made the whole thing up just to score a few political points over his opponents. Why go to that trouble? So, where was Atlantis? Here's the first question. And we've only got a few minutes left here, a couple of minutes left, and we're done. So to save you from having to look it up, Plato's description of the location of Atlantis is as follows. He says this is a quote from Plato. In front of the mouth, which you Greeks call the Pillars of Hercules, which is, I think we know today, the Straits of Gibraltar, there lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia combined. And it was possible for the travelers of that time to cross from it to the other islands, and from the islands to the whole of the continent over against them which encompasses the real ocean, which would be the Atlantic beyond. And so this is what Plato says about the location. not far really from the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar. So not only does Plato mention other islands beside the main island of Atlantis, but he also the continent, which we now know as North and South America, which encompasses the real ocean, or Atlantic as we know it. And Plato goes on to say, now in this island of Atlantis there existed a confederation of kings of great and marvelous power, which held sway over all the island and over many other islands, and also and parts of the continent. Now this is interesting to me. It tells us that aside from their main centers on the motherland, the Atlanteans had colonies on other islands in the Atlantic Ocean, and in the Americas, as they came to be known, as they had in Europe, too, as we're going to see later as we go on, because right now, guess what? We're out of time. I find this stuff interesting and fascinating. You can go look some of this stuff up. Look up Plato's. Here's a little homework for you. Look up Plato's accounts of Atlantis online and read through them. And join me here again tomorrow night. We're going to take a 23-hour break, and we'll be right back, so sit tight.